The call came on a Tuesday in March. A woman named Karen from Human Resources at Harmon Logistics, where my husband Greg had worked for 9 years. She said she needed to discuss something sensitive involving my husband, paused the way people pause when they've rehearsed delivering bad news, and asked if I could come in. I thought, benefits paperwork, insurance update. I said yes, tomorrow morning was fine. I hung up and stood in the kitchen holding my phone, trying to think of a single reason why an HR department would need to see me in person. That night Greg came home, asked what was for dinner, washed his hands at the sink, sat at the table. He was relaxed, easy, normal in the way that only the innocent or the very practiced can sustain. I didn't mention Karen's call. I wanted to know what I was walking into before I gave him the chance to explain it in his own terms. The next morning I drove to his office with a thermos of coffee, and no idea I had been inside Harmon Logistics exactly 3 times in 9 years. The company Christmas party in 2018, a quick drop-off when Greg forgot his laptop, and once very early in his time there, when I brought him lunch during a hard week and sat in the lobby for 15 minutes waiting for him to come downstairs. That's not unusual. Most people don't spend much time imagining the floor plan of where their spouse works. You know the company name. You know roughly which exit off the highway. You have the main number saved in your phone as Greg Work, and you've never actually had to use it. The job runs alongside your life, separate, unseen, existing on its own terms while you deal with the kitchen and the school schedules and the small daily machinery of a household. Karen met me in the lobby. She was in her mid-40s, measured and professional. With reading glasses she kept removing and replacing as she spoke. She walked me to a conference room, the kind with a door that closes and no windows to the hallway, and offered me water. I said I was fine. She explained that Harmon Logistics had recently concluded an internal investigation into a workplace environment complaint. She couldn't share the details of the original complaint, she said, privacy policy. But the investigation had surfaced information involving Greg that the company had a legal obligation to disclose to relevant parties. She said relevant parties, with the particular gravity of a phrase that has been reviewed by an attorney. I asked what the information was. She said Greg had been in a personal relationship with a coworker named Diane Pierce for approximately 3 years. That the relationship had been, she chose her words slowly, an open secret within the department for most of that duration. That when the original complaint was filed by someone else about something entirely different, the investigation had produced testimony that made Greg and Diane's relationship impossible to overlook. And that Greg, during the course of the investigation, had declined to respond to HR's contact attempts on multiple occasions. Multiple occasions. I took a moment to understand what that meant. He had ignored their calls, kept ignoring them, and I was listed as his emergency contact at Harmon, the person on file for exactly this kind of situation, the person the company reached when they couldn't reach him. Greg had apparently decided that letting his wife walk into a stranger's conference room and hear about 3 years of another relationship was preferable to picking up the phone. "How long did you say?" I asked. "Approximately 3 years," she said. 3 years. Lily had started high school 3 years ago. I had a specific memory of that September. Driving her to school on the first day, watching her walk through the entrance doors without looking back, sitting in the car afterward and crying quietly on the way home. I called Greg from the parking lot. He answered on the second ring, warm and easy, told me she was going to be fine, that she was ready. His voice was the voice of a present husband, connected, attentive. He had been with Diane Pierce for at least a month by then. Karen didn't owe me anything beyond what the company's legal team had directed her to share. She was doing her job, following a script that had been approved by attorneys, and the script ended at a specific line. I understood that. But she was also, I could see, a person. And the way she looked at me when I reached for the water told me she was not entirely comfortable with what she'd been asked to do. I asked questions. She answered some and not others. I asked what open secret meant in specific terms. She said multiple employees had been aware of the relationship, and that it had been discussed within the department on more than one occasion. That the investigation had produced consistent, independent accounts of the relationship across multiple interviewees. Consistent and independent, she said it like she was reading from a report, which she probably was. The phrasing told me something. This wasn't a rumor that had circulated once and faded. Multiple people had told the same story separately, without knowing what the others had said. That's not noise. That's confirmation. I asked if Diane still worked at Harmon. She said she couldn't comment on other employees' status. I asked if Greg's position was at risk. She said the company was still determining appropriate next steps, and that Greg would receive formal communication. She said it carefully, and I had already learned enough in the past hour to understand that careful non-answers to yes or no questions are almost always yes. Then I asked the question I hadn't been able to stop forming since the moment she said, "Open secret." I asked, if this had been going on for 3 years, and if people in the department had known about it for most of that time, why hadn't anyone said anything to me? Karen didn't answer that. She held my gaze for a moment and then she said, "I'm sorry this is how you're finding out." It was a professional response. Trained almost certainly. But she said it quietly, without looking away, and I believed she meant it. I walked back through the lobby past the front desk and out to the parking lot. I got into my car and sat with the engine off. Outside, trucks moved along the highway behind the building. A few employees came out through the side door and walked to their cars without glancing at me. The drive home is a stretch of highway I take 3 or 4 times a week. I know every exit, every merge, the place where traffic slows near the mall overpass. I drove it on autopilot that morning without registering any of it. What I was doing instead of watching the road was beginning the arithmetic you cannot stop once you start. Placing events on a timeline. Revisiting your own life with a new key. Calculating the distance between what you thought was happening and what was actually happening, and what that distance measured in months and years means about the shape of the life you thought you were living. I got home. I made a cup of coffee I didn't drink. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at Greg's chair, the one where he sat every morning with his phone and his coffee and asked me what I had going on that day. And I tried to understand what it meant to have shared a table with someone for 14 years and not known the actual dimensions of their life. Tyler's backpack was by the door. Lily's jacket was over the staircase banister. The house looked exactly like it always looked. That was the strangest part. I want to tell you what open secret looked like in practice because I've had time to piece it together. From conversations I had later with people who had been there. From what Marcus told me over coffee a week after the HR meeting. And from a few things I found on my own. Diane Pierce had been at Harmon for 6 years. She was a sales coordinator in Greg's department. Not his direct report, technically 1 degree removed in the org chart, but close enough that there was an internal policy requiring disclosure if the relationship became personal. It never was disclosed. Either Greg didn't know the policy existed, which I doubt after 9 years in management, or he knew it and calculated that the cost of disclosure was greater than the risk of concealment. He made that calculation and kept making it every week for 3 years. The people who knew about the relationship included, from what I was eventually able to confirm, 3 of Greg's direct reports who had noticed patterns over time, a warehouse manager named Marcus who had twice driven them to the same hotel during company offsites in Indianapolis, and the woman at the front desk who had noticed that Greg and Diane left together on Friday afternoons with a regularity that eventually stopped feeling coincidental. That front desk employee had mentioned it to a friend. That friend was interviewed during the investigation. That's how it surfaced. Not through anyone's decision to come forward, not through conscience or loyalty to me, but through a casual conversation about something else entirely that happened to contain, inside it, the thing that unraveled everything. They had been careful. That word came up more than once when I was trying to understand how this had sustained itself. Not theatrical careful, Not the kind of carefulness that draws attention by its obvious effort. Genuinely careful in a way that was harder to see through precisely because it didn't look like an effort at all. There were no visible signals inside the office. No lingering eye contact across conference tables. No behavior that would have read as obviously romantic. What they had, instead, was a working rhythm so established it had become invisible. They collaborated constantly, which made proximity unremarkable. They attended every company event and sat near each other, which made sense given they were in the same department. They handled scheduling conflicts with the easy accommodation of people who wanted to be in the same places at the same times and had built a legitimate work structure that made that look normal. Over 3 years, this accumulation of small, ordinary behaviors became the backdrop. Visible to the people in close enough proximity to notice the patterns, but not alarming enough to any single person to prompt a single action. Person after person decided it wasn't their place. Person after person made the calculation that the discomfort of saying something outweighed the discomfort of not saying it. I understand that math. I've had to understand it because the alternative is spending the rest of my life furious at a dozen people for a failure I'm not certain I would have handled differently, from where they were standing. But I also know what that collective silence produced. A woman me who was driving her husband to the airport, who was packing his bag when he was running late, who was texting safe travels and meaning it, who was living beside a marriage whose actual shape she had never been allowed to see. That woman deserved more than an unrelated HR complaint to eventually give her the truth. And no one in 3 years gave it to her. I still sit with that sometimes. On Tuesday mornings when my mind goes somewhere it didn't plan to. Greg came home at 6:45 the evening after I visited Harmon. I had been sitting in the kitchen for 4 hours. I had made dinner, baked chicken, rice, a salad because Lily and Tyler still needed to eat, and because I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't thinking. He walked in, set his bag in the hall, mentioned traffic. He kissed me on the cheek. He washed his hands at the sink and dried them on the dish towel the way he always did. The way that had been so familiar for so long it had become part of the ambient sound of our house. He sat down at the table and asked Lily about her history project, and she answered, and he asked a follow-up question that showed he'd actually remembered what the project was about. He passed the rice to Tyler without being asked because he knew Tyler always wanted more rice. He was present, engaged, performing nothing or performing it so well there was no seam. I watched his face for any crack in the surface, something that would tell me he knew. That Karen had called him too, that the office had reached him some other way, that he was sitting at this table knowing that I knew and waiting for me to say it first. There was nothing. His face was untroubled. He made Lily laugh about something near the end of dinner and the laugh sounded real. His appetite was normal. Either he didn't know what had happened at Harmon that morning, or he was a man who could hold an entire other life inside himself and bring none of it to the dinner table. Looking back, I think it was both things at different times. That night he genuinely didn't know. Other nights over the past 3 years, he had known and still passed the rice and still asked about the history project and still laughed at the right moments. That's the part I've had to sit with the longest. I said nothing that night. Not because I wasn't ready. I had assembled the conversation in my head across those 4 hours in more versions than I could count. I said nothing because Greg was skilled at reframing, and I had seen it enough times in smaller conflicts to know I didn't want to walk into a conversation about this until I had everything I could have. He had a way of repositioning things until you weren't entirely sure which angle was the true one. Contractor problems, schedule conflicts, money discussions that resolved without feeling fully resolved. He was good at it, patient, and I was not going to give him the opening to do it here. After dinner, I told him I was tired and went upstairs early. He said okay. He stayed downstairs. The television came on. I lay in our bed with my phone and started going backward through our life. The way you do when you have new information and nowhere left to put it. 14 years of marriage. 9 years at Harmon Logistics. 3 years with Diane. There is an arithmetic you cannot stop once you start. You put the timeline down in front of you and ask, what was I doing then? What did I think was happening? And then you ask what was actually happening. And the gap between those two answers, the size of it, measured in months and ordinary mornings, becomes the thing you measure everything else against. 3 years ago, I was sitting in a school parking lot crying because time moved too fast. And Greg was on his lunch break, warm and present, already a month into something that would run alongside our life for 3 more years without my ever feeling a single thing that made me stop and look twice. I have had to decide that doesn't say something about me. I'm still working on believing it. 2 days after the meeting with Karen, I pulled 3 years of phone records. Our wireless account was on autopay through a shared login. I had the credentials. I went in on the second night while Greg was watching television downstairs, sat at the desk in the spare room, and pulled the call history from his line going back 36 months. The carrier doesn't archive content, only metadata. Time, duration, frequency, number. That was enough. There was a number that appeared in Greg's outgoing calls beginning in late November, 3 years earlier. Not every day, 2 or 3 times a week on average, sometimes more, occasionally less. It appeared most often during business hours, sometimes in the evenings, a handful of times in the early morning during weeks I now recognized as travel weeks. The contact was listed in his phone's address book under the initials DL. I had seen that label before, at some point when his phone was sitting on the counter and I glanced at it the way you glance at things that aren't yours. I had never thought to ask what it meant. There were hundreds of contacts in his phone. DL had never come up in conversation. There was no reason it would have. I searched the number online. LinkedIn appeared first. Diane Pierce, Sales Coordinator, Harmon Logistics. A professional headshot. Dark hair, mid-30s in the photo, probably closer to 38 now. A smile that was practiced and pleasant and completely ordinary. That's the thing no one warns you about. You expect the other person to look like something, like an explanation, like a reason, like something that makes the choice intelligible. Instead, she looked like someone you'd sit beside on a plane and forget before you landed. I also went through his home office. 2 days after the Harmon meeting, while he was in the shower, I went in slowly and opened each drawer. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. What I found was a hotel receipt folded once in the back of the bottom left drawer. A property in Indianapolis, March of the prior year. 2 nights, room charge, taxes, 1 dinner from the hotel restaurant. Charged to his personal card. He had told me that company offsites were typically covered by Harmon. Sometimes they were. I'd had no reason to know which were and which weren't, and no reason to look. I read the receipt twice. I put it back exactly the way I found it, face up, folded once in the back of the drawer. I closed the drawer and stood in his office for a long moment. Above the desk, a shelf of books, a framed photo of him and the kids at a baseball game 3 summers ago. Tyler holding a foam finger and grinning. On the desk, charging cables in a coil, a notepad, a pen holder he'd had since before we got married. I went downstairs. Tyler had come home from school with that particular low-grade hunger that 13-year-olds carry through the door without announcing it, filling the kitchen just by being there. I made him a grilled cheese sandwich. He sat at the counter and talked about something his history teacher had said, and I listened and laughed where the laugh belonged, and he ate his sandwich and didn't notice anything about me that wasn't what it always was. That was the thing about those days. Life kept arriving and asking me to show up in it. And I did. Because the alternative was explaining why I couldn't, and I wasn't. 3 days after the HR meeting, Greg received a letter from Harmon. I know because I saw his face change at the mailbox. He came inside with the rest of the mail and left 1 envelope on the kitchen counter, separate from the stack, unopened. He went to get a glass of water. His back was to me. He stood at the sink for a moment longer than necessary. I asked if everything was okay. He said yes. Something from work he needed to deal with. He carried the envelope to his home office and closed the door. He was in there for close to an hour. At one point I heard his voice through the wall, low, deliberate, the particular register of a person choosing every word before it leaves their mouth. I couldn't hear what he said. I heard the cadence of it. Careful. Controlled. Nothing like the easy, half-distracted way he talked on the phone with his brother or his college friends. When he came out, he said he might need to go into the office on Saturday. Something had come up. He said it while looking at a point slightly past my shoulder, toward the window over the kitchen sink. What kind of something? I asked. HR paperwork, he said. He said it without hesitation, without a flicker. 14 years of marriage, 2 children, a mortgage, a life built room by room. And he stood in our kitchen and described 3 years with another woman, and a formal HR investigation into that relationship as paperwork. Like he was talking about updating his direct deposit. Like it was something mildly inconvenient that would resolve itself with a signature and an hour of his Saturday. I said okay. That word sat in the room for a moment. Okay. I had been saying it my whole marriage. Okay to the travel schedules. Okay to the budget conversations that never quite resolved. Okay to the accumulated weight of small concessions I hadn't noticed adding up until now. I looked at him holding that envelope in our kitchen and thought, this is the last time I am going to say okay without knowing exactly what I am agreeing to. I needed one more thing before I sat down across from him and ended the version of our life he thought was still intact. I needed to hear from someone who had actually been inside that office during those 3 years. Someone who had watched this play out and stayed quiet about it and might, now that it was already unraveling, be willing to tell me what watching it had actually looked like from the inside. There was one name from Greg's office I knew personally. Marcus, a warehouse manager who had been at Greg's 40th birthday party 4 years ago. We talked for 20 minutes that night about his commute, his kids, his attempt to learn to cook because his wife worked night shifts. He struck me as a person who told the truth when it mattered more than it cost. I found his number through a mutual LinkedIn connection and sent him a text. I said I needed to ask him something and that I needed him to be honest with me. He took 4 hours to respond. Then okay. Where? I named a coffee place on the south side of town that neither of us had any reason to be regulars at. He said Thursday morning. I said I'd be there. I spent the next 2 days maintaining the surface of my life, making school lunches, returning client emails, going to sleep beside Greg at the usual time and lying in the dark listening to his breathing settle into sleep while mine didn't, and waiting for Thursday. I thought about canceling more than once. I thought about walking into the kitchen and simply saying what I knew, but I needed to see it as completely as I could before I said the word that would end everything. I owed that to myself. I had spent 14 years making decisions. Marcus came in looking like a man who had rehearsed multiple versions of this conversation and wasn't sure which one he was going to use. He was still employed at Harmon, still trying to understand what the investigation's fallout meant for his own standing. He had agreed to this meeting and I could see, from the way he sat down and kept his hands around his coffee cup, that he was still deciding exactly how much to say. He was calculating in real time the way careful people do when they care about their own position but also, somewhere under that, care about doing the right thing. He was careful with his words but not evasive. There is a real difference. He told me he had known about Greg and Diane for close to 2 years. He had heard about it from 2 separate people before he ever saw anything himself, and when he did see it, saw the way they moved in each other's orbit during the ordinary workday. He understood why the information had circulated and also why it had stayed contained for as long as it had. They didn't act like people in the middle of something secret. That was what he kept coming back to. No obvious tension. No visible effort at concealment. Nothing that announced itself. What they had looked like from the outside was 2 colleagues who worked well together and had developed a comfortable professional shorthand after years in the same department. The kind of chemistry that reads as competence and ease rather than as anything personal. If you weren't close enough to notice the specific texture of their interactions, You wouldn't find anything to notice. But if you were close enough, same offsites, same daily rhythms, you eventually saw something else. The way Greg was less guarded when Diane was present. The way she anticipated things about him that weren't strictly work-related to anticipate. Small things, individually unconvincing. But things that accumulated into a shape you couldn't unsee once you had seen it. Marcus saw the shape. Several people saw it. And they did what most people do when they see something like that at a workplace. They decided it wasn't their place. They went home on Fridays, left it at the office, told themselves it wasn't their business, and then went back on Monday and made the same decision again. I asked him to sit with the question of whether that had been right. I tried to ask it without accusation because I needed him to actually think about it, not defend himself. He was quiet for a minute, long enough that I thought he might deflect. Then he set down his coffee and said, "No, I don't think it was the right call. I think we made the easier choice, and the person who paid for it wasn't us." He paused. "I can't tell you I would have done it differently if I had it to go back to," he said. "I might have made the same choice again, but it wasn't right. And I think you deserve to hear me say that." That was the most honest thing anyone said to me across the entire experience. Not a performance of remorse. Not a deflection. Just a person sitting across from someone who had absorbed the consequence of a decision he'd made, and saying, "I know what I did and I know what it cost you." I thanked him. He said he was sorry, the kind that comes from knowing what you did rather than simply knowing you're supposed to say it. I drove home thinking about what it costs to be the person at the end of that evening. I called my friend Susan. We had known each other since our mid-20s. The kind of friendship that survives years of not properly talking and picks up exactly where it left off. Susan was steady in the specific way I needed at the end of that week. She came over. I made tea. Neither of us touched it. We sat on the back porch and I told her everything in order. The HR call, Karen's conference room, the open secret, the phone records, the hotel receipt, Marcus, what he had said about the office and the easier choice. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat with it for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want to do? Not what are you going to do? Not what should you do? What do you want?" Stopped me. It was the first time in a week that anyone had asked me something centered on what I needed, rather than on what was happening around me. And the honest answer was that I didn't fully know yet. I knew I was going to talk to Greg. I knew I was going to sit down across from him and put it all on the table and let him try to explain 3 years, and then explain why he had ignored HR's calls and let me drive to that office building without a word of warning. But what I wanted beyond that confrontation, what I needed the future to look like, I hadn't gotten there yet. I hadn't had space to get there. That night I asked Greg if we could talk. He sat down at the kitchen table with the stillness of someone who has been waiting and is almost relieved when the thing finally arrives. I told him about Harmon, about Karen and the conference room, the phone records, deal, the hotel receipt I had found in his desk drawer and put back exactly the way I found it, Marcus and what Marcus had said. I laid it out without heat. I was calm in the way you can only be calm when you've spent a week grieving something before you've said it out loud. Greg didn't deny it. That surprised me more than anything else. I had prepared for the Greg I knew in arguments, the reframing, the gentle repositioning. What I got was a man who put his elbows on the table, looked at the wood and said, "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to stop." I sat with that. 14 years. 2 kids. A wife who packed his bag and texted safe travels and meant it every time. And the explanation was that he didn't know how to stop. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. Because this kind of story, the kind that lives inside ordinary marriages across ordinary weeks, is what we're here for. The real version. And it matters. Greg asked what I was thinking. I told him I was thinking about the 11 times I had driven him to the airport in the past year and a half. The bag I packed when he was running late. The texts. Safe travels, let me know when you land. The trips he described afterward while I listened and never once thought to question any of it. I said it without anger, like someone reading from a document, establishing facts before a larger conversation. He didn't say anything. I told him I needed a few days before I knew what I wanted to do next. He asked if he should leave. I said yes. He packed a bag that night and drove to his brother's house 40 minutes away. I stood in our bedroom after the front door closed and looked at his side of the bed and thought about the particular quality of a room that has. Greg stayed at his brother's for 10 days. During that time I met with a family law attorney named Patricia, who had the manner of someone who has heard every version of every story and remains genuinely interested in the details of each one. She walked me through what dissolution would look like. The house, the retirement accounts, Greg's car, the kids' custody arrangement, the timeline. She was thorough and unemotional in the way I needed someone to be, not cold, just clear. She spoke about the logistics of dividing a life with the same matter-of-fact precision that made the whole thing feel survivable. I also told Lily and Tyler during those 10 days. Not everything. Not the way I've told it here. But enough. Lily was 16 and had already been reading the house differently since Greg left. She was perceptive in the way teenage girls can be, tracking the emotional weather of every room she walked into. I sat with her on her bed and told her that her dad and I were dealing with something serious and figuring out what it meant. She cried. I held her. She asked if it was because of something at his work, and I said yes, partly. And she accepted that the way you accept an incomplete answer to something you already half know. Tyler was harder in a different way. He was 13 and operated at a more concrete level. He wanted to know if his dad was coming back, whether he'd stay at the same school, what the schedule would look like on holidays. I answered what I could answer. For the things I didn't know yet, I told him I'd let him know as soon as I did, and I meant it. Holding your children's grief alongside your own is something no one prepares you for adequately. You become a container for two separate losses simultaneously. You can't collapse in front of them, but you also can't perform a stability you don't have because they can feel the difference, especially at 16 and 13. You find the narrow line between authentic and composed, and you walk it every day, and some days the walking takes everything you have. I called Greg after 10 days. I told him I wanted to file. He said he understood. He didn't argue, didn't ask for more time, didn't suggest counseling. He had known, I think, which direction this was moving, had known it longer than I had, maybe, and had been carrying that knowledge alongside everything else. When I gave it a name, it was almost a relief for both of us. Not the same kind of relief, but something in the same direction. What I understood in the days after that call was something I am still arriving at slowly. The HR call was not the beginning of the end of my marriage. It was the moment I found out my marriage had already ended. The distance between those two things, the ending and the finding out, was 3 years. 3 years of ordinary life that was happening on top of something else entirely, and I was the last person in Greg's professional world to know it. Inside those 3 years were hundreds of ordinary Tuesdays, pasta dinners, school pickups, the times he said I love you at the end of a phone call and probably meant it while also sustaining the other thing. I have had to make room for that complexity, for a person being both real and false at the same time, because the version where he was only one of those things doesn't hold. And I need the true version even when the true version is harder. The divorce took 8 months. Patricia said that was relatively fast for a marriage with our asset structure and 2 kids. It felt like a long time and no time at all, the way major events compress and expand differently depending on where you're standing when you look at them. I took the house. Greg took the larger retirement account. We structured a custody arrangement for Lily and Tyler that gives both of us real time with them and gives them a stable schedule, which is the best thing you can build when you're dividing a family into a new shape. Some weeks the logistics run smoothly. Some weeks something needs renegotiating. That is parenting. It just has more moving parts now. Greg's position at Harmon was eliminated at the end of the fiscal year. He found work eventually at a smaller company 2 hours north, closer to his brother. Diane Pierce's situation resolved through what Marcus described as a mutual separation. I don't know more than that, and I don't need to. The things I've had to sit with are not the dramatic ones. Not the conference room, not the confrontation in the kitchen, not the night Greg packed a bag and drove away. The things I've had to sit with are quieter. The way his voice sounded on the phone when I called him during Lily's first day of high school. The warmth in it. The ease. That warmth was real. He meant it. He was also, that same week, a month into something he would sustain for 3 more years. Those two things were both true at the same time inside the same person. I have had to find a way to hold that without trying to resolve it into something simpler, because it doesn't resolve. It just becomes something you carry differently over time. I've talked with other women who've been through something with the same architecture. The long secret. The late discovery. The question of who you are once you understand that the life you thought you were living was partly constructed without your knowledge. What most of us find, not quickly, not cleanly, is not rage and not forgiveness. Something quieter. A settling back into yourself after a long time of being partly someone else's story. I am 42. Lily is a senior this year. Tyler has taken up woodworking. Actual woodworking, a workbench in the garage, pieces he makes with his hands that will hold weight and last. Watching him make things feels like something I can't fully articulate. Like repair happening at the right distance. My accounting practice has added 3 new clients in the past year. I run on Tuesday mornings, which I started after Greg left, and have kept because I needed it more than I expected to. I am not who I was before that Tuesday in March. I am also still her in some important ways. The parts of you that live through something like this don't disappear. They get incorporated into the person you are now, into the way you read a room, into the things you're willing to say out loud that you might not have said before. If any part of this story lives somewhere close to your own experience, stay with me. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. We're here for the real stories. The ones that don't look dramatic from the outside but cost everything on the inside. Subscribe. And leave a comment, tell me what you recognized. I want to close with something Karen said. At the end of our meeting, when she handed me the water and I was getting ready to stand up, she said, "I'm sorry this is how you're finding out." I've turned that sentence over for more than a year now. At first it struck me as professional courtesy, the appropriate thing a person says when they've been asked to deliver news they didn't create and can't fix. But I keep coming back to it because I think it held something more specific. She was sorry about the how, not just the what. The what was Greg's. The affair, the sustained concealment, the 3 years of choosing to continue something he knew would cost everything if it ever came to light. That was his work, and I've had to let it belong to him. Not as a gift, but as a fact. It lives in his ledger, not mine. But the how is something larger. Finding out from a stranger in a conference room I'd never been to because my husband had decided not to answer his phone, because an entire department had watched something unfold for 3 years and collectively decided it was not their place to say anything, because the information that most directly affected my life had moved through a network of dozens of people before it reached me. That is not one person's failure. It is a failure distributed across many people, made in small quiet increments, and I am what it accumulated into. I don't say that to assign blame to everyone who stayed quiet. I've made something like peace with that, or I'm in the process of making it. I say it because I think it's worth naming. Because it happens constantly in offices and neighborhoods and families. Someone knows something that would change things for another person. They calculate the cost of saying it against the cost of not saying it. They decide the social math doesn't work in favor of speaking. And the person who most needs to know is the last one to find out. You probably recognize some version of this. The thing someone should have told someone else. The information that moved through everyone it shouldn't have before it reached the person it was for. I am not who I was before that Tuesday in March. I also still am in the ways that matter. The same person with a clearer view of the actual terrain. That is not nothing. That is what I would ask for. If this story meant something to you, share it with 5 people who might need to hear it. Leave a comment. Tell me what you recognized, what you'd want someone like Karen to say differently. And tell me what you want us to talk about next. We're here every